Hello, Rick here with another lore video. So this one is going to attempt to recap the Temporal Cold War as told in Star Trek Online, which is going to be a bit of a tough case as I can't really tell it chronologically as I have done with other recaps or lore dumps. This all centres around the signing of the Temporal Accords in the year 2769 and the opposition to them from numerous other factions. The Temporal Accords were signed between numerous powers from the Galactic Union, which included the Federation at this time, as well as the Dominion and many other governments. Up until this point, time travel had been used by the Federation for primarily research and fixing alterations in accordance with its own Temporal Prime Directive, but not every species abided by the same rules. All too frequently, there were those powers or individuals who would exploit time travel to their own ends, and after many mistakes and alterations to the timeline, the Temporal Accords were agreed upon to put an end to the dangers of time travel. We already saw an alteration in the form of the Xindi attack in 2152-3 in Enterprise, and it's left open to interpretation if the timeline was irrevocably altered or if the shows are supposed to have always taken place in this timeline. Issues like this are why the Accords were made, severely regulating time travel's use and giving oversights to agencies such as the Federation Time Fleet and, by the 31st century, whatever agency Daniels worked for. However, the very fact that these Accords were to regulate time travel meant that often agencies from various points in time would end up working together to facilitate their duties and even regulate incidents from before 2769 that would jeopardise the mutual cooperation that resulted in the formation of the Accords and their parties. During the Long War's Iconian year of 2410, the Federation allied with a pocket of Krenim survivors, led by researcher Noye and his Tutarian wife, Clouder, who had discovered and continued Anorax's research into a timeship. In a last effort to end the Iconian threat, the Federation Klingon-Romulan Alliance funded the project. During testing of the temporal weapon to create an alteration that would delay the Iconian invasion, a miscalculation resulted in an alteration of the time stream, of little impact for the Alpha Quadrant, but it resulted in the disappearance of the Tutarian species, including Noye's wife Clouder. Deciding against further such alterations, the Krenim timeship was instead used to send back an away team to restore the Iconians' cultural archive, the World Heart, to them and call a ceasefire. Ultimately, this was a paradox, as it was the absence of the World Heart from the time of Iconia's fall that led to them becoming more militaristic. Either way, not important right now. The use of time travel on such a scale in 2410 to end a war was a signifier to the temporal powers of later years that the Alliance needed to be made aware of the greater picture and timeline. As a result, embedded operatives of Daniels' time agency were activated and tasked with taking part in ensuring that the timeline the Accords were created to maintain continued. So far, things were happening as they were supposed to, with agents all throughout the time liaising to protect it. Things began to go awry with the creation of the Tox Uthat, a quantum phase inhibitor that could manipulate matter at a quantum level and result in the alteration of a star's life cycle or many other effects. The device was created in the 2600s by a scientist called Carl Dano, partly because of the curiosity of invention, but also to protect the home system of some of his ancestors, the Lucari. Their sun was acting strangely because the Tholians were attempting to lure out Carl Dano by collapsing the Lucari sun at the tail end of 2410. Eventually, the system is saved with the use of the Tox Uthat, but Carl Dano loses it to the Tholians, who then aim to use it on another species, the Nakul. This is out of revenge for a slight that the Nakul haven't even committed yet, and ultimately the beginning of many such paradoxes that mark the Temporal War, as such a mess to follow. The Nakul sun is collapsed and reduced to an irreversible cinder, with the Nakul already isolationist. They were driven into straight-up xenophobia. They go on to become one of the factions to oppose the Temporal Accords in 2769, as their homeworld's loss is already part of the timeline that led up to the Accords, and those who signed won't risk altering things further by saving them. Plus, where does it end? If every species tries to save its own skin and idealise its future, then there's no point in the Accords, and the ramifications could be catastrophic and never-ending. It's tough, but the line had to be drawn somewhere. A more aggressive faction of Na'Kul under General Vosk and researcher Krog intended on using time travel to mess with the Temporal Accords by preventing the formation of the powers around them. In the 29th century, General Vosk comes into conflict with the 29th century Federation Time Fleet, but manages to escape through his time tunnel to the year 1944, where he encounters Captain Archer, redirected by Daniels, and is defeated. We'll touch on that later. Anyway, now we're going to follow the Tox Uthat for a while as it changes hands and hops across time, being pursued by temporal agents. It is recovered by Carl in 2410 from the Tholians, and taken to a pre-colonised riser and buried in a shoreline cave network. Unfortunately, Carl ship is damaged, and the temporal drive fires off. This takes the ship way back into the past, where it would become the subject of an arms race between the Enterprise NX-01, the local era Tholians, and the Suliban Cabal in 2152. At the same time, in 2152, the Vorgon mercenaries, Adjur and Baratus, arrive from their time jumps pursuing Carl vessel, and supposedly the Tox Uthat, unaware that it is no longer in his possession, and that he's dead. They are driven off again by temporal agents. At a later point, Captain Walker and these same temporal agents recover the timeship and Carl body from 2152 using a temporal transporter, when the ship's beacon was activated by Commander Trip Tucker. Over the centuries, Risa is transformed into the holiday planet, the course of the rivers are altered, and the cave dries out. In 2366, Captain Jean-Luc Picard and the rogue Vash locate the Tox Uthat after time travellers from Carl time, Adjur and Baratus, attempt to retrieve it to sell off. The device is recorded as destroyed by Picard, but in secret he sends it to Starfleet, who store it in their high security vault at Starfleet HQ for future study. Here it remains a buried secret until the two mercenaries try again in 2375, using the Dominion Battle of Sol as cover to steal it. This is foiled by Daniels and his recruited agents who, as I said, have been jumping throughout time to prevent it from being stolen. Eventually, the Tox Uthat is recovered by Agent Daniels from Federation custody in 2375, as it is no longer secure and will be needed for the upcoming confrontations. Back in 2410, Krenim researcher Noy learns of the prior timeline that the Federation accidentally erased while experimenting with his timeship when he was studying its shielded archives. He learns of the removal of the Tutarian species, and specifically his wife Claudia. This leads him to dwell upon the folly of the Federation and begins him down a path of vengeance. He steals the timeship, christened the Anoraks, and departs after suspicion is brought upon him by temporal agents from the future. He becomes horribly twisted by time travel, so as to become unrecognisable, but this is because he is effectively operating from a future that didn't exist yet, one where the Temporal Accords were not signed. As he manipulates events to ensure this future, his appearance is restored and his desired timeline is ratified. One of his first actions is to travel to 2769 to declare the tyranny of the Temporal Accords at an end. This is met with applause from some, like the Na'Kul, who, after initially skirmishing with the Krenim, allied with them, forming the Temporal Liberation Front. They are driven off by Captain Walker of the 29th century and other agents. The Envoy, as he now calls himself, manages to make an attack on New Khitomer, specifically the temporal observation posts, which enable a brief window of opportunity where the monitoring of time travel fails. Utilising this, he begins recruiting more to his cause. In retaliation for the temporal agent's defence, Noye returns to 2410, moments after his initial departure, to try to prevent pursuit and further attempts to stop him. This too fails, and he begins his career as the Envoy properly. He attempts to recruit the Romulans in 2260 by presenting them with a doomsday weapon at Galorndun Core through Krog. This was foiled by temporal agents, and the Romulan colony rendered into the state we see it in the next generation, when the planet killer falls onto it. In 2268, the Na'Kul ally with the Orion Syndicate to foil the Babel Conference, again interfering with the formation of the Alliance. This is halted by temporal agents, including one Captain Chekhov, who goes undercover on his former vessel. During this bout, however, Chekhov's temporal beacon is discovered by Montgomery Scott, who fortunately is more responsible and keeps it hidden for his entire life because Temporal Prime Directive. In 2217, the Na'Kul bring neural parasites to Deep Space K7 in order to overrun the station, but this is foiled by Agent Daniels, undercover as Ensign Hunter on a Pioneer-class starship. This vessel is later recorded as being destroyed in 2270 at the Battle of Caleb 4, and it is, but Daniels manages to save the command crew and recruit them as temporal agents to be placed in 2410. This event also sees the Envoy fail to recruit the Klingons. Also in this year, Gorn Federation relations were endangered when a cloaked vessel destroyed a Gorn ship over Erdrin 4, but this alteration was minor and rectified by local era forces. A meeting with the Sphere Builders occurs in the Kelvin universe in 2270 with the USS Yorktown dealing with a new expanse, forming another attempt from Sphere Builders to enter into a new universe. After all, the Sphere Builders are extra-dimensional, so the Prime Reality isn't the only one they're able to press into. During the battle, a team of temporal agents from the Prime Reality learn that the Sphere Builders are actually the Tutarians, cut out of time and cast adrift, seeking to return. Their efforts back in 2153, manipulating the Xindi into destroying Earth, and in other realities are all to allow them back into the universe, to have revenge on the Federation. Furthermore, they are now in league with the Envoy, Noi, who is aiding them in their return. The renegade Kranim also appears to Baratus in 2375 after they failed to steal the Tox Uthat a second time, which resulted in the death of Adja. Utilising his grief, he managed to recruit the influential Vorgon to the Temporal Liberation Front too. He also makes overtures to the Mirror Universe of 2410 and manages to secure the services of Admiral Lita of the Imperial Starfleet, but that alliance is short-lived. The Terrans bail when things start shifting in favour of the Galactic Union. During the first Khitomer Alliance conference in 2410, Krog manages to almost assassinate the Klingon Chancellor and Federation President, which in turn disrupts the talks enough to jeopardise the future of the Temporal Accords. In order to stop this, Captain Walker of the 29th Century Time Fleet arrives to escort the 2410 Temporal Agents to a point in the future before Krog jumps back. This is the time from where Vosk makes his jump back to 1944. This is regarded as the event which catapulted the Cold War into full-on conflict. With things escalating, the Tox Uthat is shepherded aboard the ship from 2410 along with Agent Daniels to be brought to New Khitomer 2769, the site of the Temporal Accords signing, in an effort to curtail events from transpiring. But the cumulative alterations to time by now have created a situation where New Khitomer has fallen to the Temporal Liberation Front. After boarding the station, Agent Daniels is killed by the TLF, who move off to return the Tutarians in the 26th century at the Procyon system. The New Khitomer station has its temporal observatories reactivated and communications re-established, allowing for an Allied time fleet to be assembled. The Battle of Procyon 5 is in the 26th century, and it marks a climactic battle between the pro-Accord forces and the Temporal Liberation Front, and has seen several iterations as it seems to be the perfect location to restore the Tutarians. Agent Daniels is in fact said to have operated in several different versions of this battle throughout the Temporal War, some where the Delphic Expanse even consumed the heart of Federation space, and many, many more. But in this timeline, Daniels died before the battle, so temporal agents from 2410 and Captain Chekhov take command of a wing of the Allied Time Fleet. This iteration sees the Tox Uthat brought to the USS Enterprise J, so that it can harness its power to collapse the spheres that are generating the devastating expanse. During the skirmish, Chekhov realises that his temporal beacon is missing when he activates it and brings a 24th century Scotty to his side in the 26th century battle. Fortunately, the Scotty proves to be a help in installing the Tox Uthat and is returned to his 24th century. After this is completed, the strike team from 2410, accompanied by a fleet of time agent vessels from a multitude of eras, moves in to secure Noi, the Envoy, and arrest him for his role in everything. With him finally secured, many of the alterations he was seeking to do are undone, and the future that ensures the Temporal Accords signing restored. Agent Daniels is therefore resurrected, and as with his deaths many times before, his timelines are consolidated into one memory and he is aware of the curtailed events. Because of Noi's events, which were further complications to the already complicated Temporal Cold War, it's quite possible that the role of the Envoy supplanted the mysterious benefactor of the Suliban Cabal as a separate entity entirely. Also, the Xindi-focused efforts of the Sphere Builders seem to also stem from before they allied with the Temporal Liberation Front, so at this point they were considered their own faction as well. The Accords limited time travel to scrutinised research only, but by the end of the 31st century, time travel was simply outlawed altogether because of the mess it can cause. Whether or not people will continue to abide by this is as of yet unknown, but it's worth pointing out that Daniels' own records did not extend beyond the 32nd century, and the galaxy had other issues to deal with in the form of the dilithium crisis. Honestly, the Temporal War couldn't end any other way, with the multitude of factions all vying to rewrite history to benefit them. It needed to stop. Entire civilizations had their existence undone, and a multitude of splinter realities were created. Not quite Doctor Who Time War levels of messy, but similar in consequence. Thanks for watching this summation of the Temporal War as presented in Star Trek Online. I'm sure it's cleared nothing up, I'm still confused by it. Well, the cool thing about it is that with any time travel conflict, paradoxes and alternate timelines are common and override each other all the time. This means that no one tale involving the war can really be discredited, as it could have happened this way, then been deleted from history by another. This is referenced with the many permutations of the Battle of Procyon 5, of which Agent Daniels is cited as a veteran. It's one of several focal points that always happen, just never the same. You can see why people hate temporal mechanics. Thanks again for watching, and if you want a more in-depth look at the war, there's always the main story series, which will continue with a new chapter soon. So, thanks again. I've been and shall be Rick again, and I'll see you next time in the future. Goodbye, hello. My brain hurts.